Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in about 1 minute. Alrighty, we'll get started as folks are still coming in, but welcome everyone to Integrating ClassroomWISE with a Trauma-Informed Schools framework. Your presenter today is Stefanie Winfield. This is the third of a 4-part series on ClassroomWISE. The first 2 sessions are recorded and on the Great Lakes MHTTC products and resource page. So you can view the recording and get the PowerPoint there. And the 4th part of the series will be on November 30th. This presentation is brought to you by the Great Lakes MHTTC and SAMHSA. The Great Lakes ATTC, MHTTC, and PTTC are all funded by SAMHSA under the following cooperative agreements. The opinions expressed in this webinar are the views of the speakers and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services and SAMHSA. This presentation was prepared for the Great Lakes MHTTC under a cooperative agreement with SAMHSA. The MHTTC network uses affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language in all of their activities. Thank you for joining us. A few housekeeping items. If you are having any technical issues, please individually message myself, Stefanie Bellman, in the chat section at the bottom of your screen, and I'll be happy to help you. If you have any questions for the speaker, please put them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. And a copy of the PowerPoint slides, as well as the recording and any additional handouts, will be available on the MHTTC website within a week. You'll also be redirected to a link at the end of the presentation to a very short survey. We would really appreciate it if you could fill it out. It takes about 3 minutes, and it's how we report our activities back to SAMHSA. We will be using automated captioning during the presentation today, and certificates of attendance will be sent out to all who attend this session in full. They'll be sent via email and take about a week or 2. Follow us on social media to see what else is upcoming for the Great Lakes ATTC, MHTTC, or PTTC. And our presenter today is Stefanie Winfield. Stefanie Winfield is an adjunct faculty instructor at the University of Denver, Colorado Graduate School of Social Work. In her past role as school mental health lead for the Mountain Plains MHTTC, Stefanie focused on providing intensive technical assistance and training to educators, teachers, administrators, and all school staff on ways to improve and enhance school mental health. Stefanie has extensive experience working in schools promoting youth sexual health, conflict and anger management, behavioral health education, and school-based healthcare. With over 20 years of experience working with nonprofits and community organizations, Stefanie has done everything from grant management and implementation to program and outcome evaluation, training, and facilitation. Thank you so much for joining us today, Stefanie, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Stefanie, for that great introduction. And thanks everyone for being with us today for Integrating ClassroomWISE with a Trauma-Informed Schools framework. As Stefanie said, this is our third in a 4-part series. And for some of you who have joined us in the past 2, some of this beginning information might sound a little familiar to you. But if you're new to the series, and we want to make sure everyone has the same information and understanding. So please bear with us as I go through some of the kind of introductory information around ClassroomWISE, and then we'll dig into really how ClassroomWISE aligns with any kind of trauma training or trauma practices that you're doing in your school and how it might be an added value to what you're already doing, which is really what we're going to talk about today and our objectives about ClassroomWISE, how it's developed and how it could benefit you, how it integrates with trauma, and some talking points for for how to talk to decision makers about adding ClassroomWISE, if that feels like a good way to go. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about ClassroomWISE, a free 3-part package for K-12 educators and school personnel to support student mental health, and how ClassroomWISE might integrate into your current mental health and trauma-informed practices and programming. So it was developed and created in partnership between the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center Network and the National Center for School Mental Health, which is based out of the University of Maryland School of Social Work. So a little background information: in 2019, the network was asked by our funder, SAMHSA, to develop a training package to assist educators in supporting the mental health of students in the classroom. We partnered with the National Center on School Mental Health and worked with them to conduct an environmental scan of educator mental health literacy training and resources already available in the field. And we also conducted a national needs assessment to help us understand what educators, school mental health staff, and mental health and education leaders across the country felt was really needed for teachers to better support students in the classroom. We reviewed the results of the environmental scan and needs assessment and developed a resource called Supporting Student Mental Health: Resources to Prepare Educators, which describes the roles of educators in supporting student mental health and provides a list of existing resources and training that instruct educators on mental health literacy. And we're going to drop that link in the chat if you're interested in looking at that. And then from that work, we conducted focus groups with a diverse group of teachers and leaders from different grade levels, ethnic backgrounds, and years of experience, as well as one-on-one interviews with mental health and education leaders. So, and from that work, we created ClassroomWISE. We have 10 regional centers: a National American Indian and Alaska Native Center, a National Hispanic and Latino Center, as well as a national coordinating office. And we all work together across the country to create this resource. So if you are not from the Great Lakes region and you have not yet connected with your regional center, please let us know in the chat and we'll help connect you. So ClassroomWISE uses evidence-based content and best practices that likely align with other evidence-based programs and practices you are already using, especially when it comes to and related to trauma-informed approaches in the school. So this is not really based on a specific program. It's agnostic to all programs, but the principles and the practices that are within the ClassroomWISE will align with all the other, hopefully, evidence-based programs and practices that you are already doing. So we'll put a link to ClassroomWISE in the chat so that you can either look as we're going in this webinar, or you can look along later and get a feel of the website and the resources within. So the course contains 6 modules. There's so much that we could cover under the umbrella of mental health literacy for educators, but there were 2 big specific content areas that resurfaced over and over across the focus groups and interviews and research with education and mental health leaders, and from the input from our regional national centers across the network. So the first big bucket of content that's imperative is promoting the mental health and well-being of students, which includes creating safe and supportive school environments, addressing stigma in the classroom, and fostering social emotional competencies. Our second big bucket of content is focused on understanding and supporting students experiencing adversity and distress. And this includes really understanding the impact of trauma and adversity on learning and behavior of students, linking students to support, and having impactful classroom strategies in your back pocket to support students with mental health concerns. So when we look at the 6 modules in this way, modules 1 through 3 really focus on the promoting of mental health and well-being of students, and we kind of can refer to this as our universal or tier 1 supports. And modules 4 through 6 look at understanding and supporting students who may already be experiencing adversity and distress. And so that kind of it falls into our tier 2 and 3 levels of support of targeted and intervention supports. And today we're looking at module 5 on trauma, which falls into that tier 2-3 bucket. And so hopefully as you look at these modules that you see an alignment with some of the other things you already have going on in your school, and that you can see how ClassroomWISE might work with professional development that you have planned for the year, and how it might align and support some of the things that you're already planning to do in training and staff. As you go through the course, you'll see hopefully lots of good reminders of best practices There's real life skills woven and embedded throughout. There are videos with real teachers and students using those skills, which I personally find so helpful because it's nice to see someone doing something that you're reading about so you can see what it looks like in practice. In the other webinars in the series, the first one we just did an overview of ClassroomWISE, and then last week we talked about sort of similarly how ClassroomWISE integrates with social emotional learning. And so you can find that, as Stefanie mentioned, the recording for that webinar, and we'll drop a link in the chat as well. And then next week, the next webinar on the 30th, we'll be talking about how ClassroomWISE really integrates with the MTSS framework, the multi-tiered systems of support. So before we really dig in, we just want to get an idea of what you are currently doing in your schools around trauma. How you, if you're talking about trauma in the classroom or school-wide, or maybe you even have district-wide or your trauma-informed school. So we'd love to, or maybe you haven't, this isn't something that your school has addressed yet. So we're going to open up a poll. We'd love to get an idea and see how you're currently addressing trauma in your schools. Hey, thanks for doing it. The results are coming in and keep jumping around. Seeing classroom school-wide efforts and some district efforts, and then a handful who have not addressed trauma yet. Almost evenly split. Okay, so nothing really, nobody's doing anything just in the classroom level, mostly either school or district-wide, and then some that have not had the opportunity to address this yet in their schools. Now it's exactly evenly distributed. So thank you all for that. That helps us kind of get an idea of where you're all at. So as I said, today we're really looking at Module 5, which is the impact of trauma and adversity on learning and behavior. And you'll see how it connects with the trauma-informed programs and practices that you may already be doing classroom-wide. I hope that you'll see some alignment there. And this module addresses ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and the impact of trauma on learning, how trauma impacts learning and brain development, and how to integrate trauma-informed practices in the classroom. So as I've said a couple times, this is the MTSS model, which I am thinking many of you have seen before and are experienced with. Your state likely has, your State Department of Education likely has an MTSS office that has lots of helpful resources and training, so hopefully you've tapped into that. So when we think about ClassroomWISE in the MTSS framework, as I said, modules 1 through 3 is really that universal support, that tier 1 that everybody gets. And modules 4 through 6 are those tier 2 and 3, which is the targeted and intensive. And again, we'll talk about that more in our last webinar in this series. But trauma-informed approaches in schools utilize a multi-tiered system of support in which the whole school tiered practices and interventions utilize systems, data, and evidence-based practices to increase social, emotional, and academic success for all students. In the universal or tier 1, trauma is addressed by ensuring all aspects of the environment are informed by the understanding of trauma and designed to foster safety, resilience, and mitigate impact and support learning. Building and maintaining trauma-informed approaches in schools start with recognizing this need, using a trauma lens to build awareness and design support, and engaging in the active pursuit of practices that will avoid re-traumatizing students. This trauma-informed work must also include supporting the adults that serve the students to ensure self-care to prevent and mitigate vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue. The practices of tier 1 include implementing universal positive behavioral interventions and supports that share trauma-informed principles, including creating a safe and supportive learning environment, building relationships, and direct instruction of school-wide expectations. Additionally, a trauma-informed universal system includes the direct instruction of social emotional skills. And then tier 2 includes targeted mental health supports provided for groups of students identified as at risk for a concern or problem. And tier 3 is intensive mental health supports designed to meet the unique needs of students who already display concerns or a problem. So I thought it was important to make sure that we have a shared definition of trauma. And there are many different ones. This is by SAMHSA. It's universally recognized and used. The definition is individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and physical, social, and emotional, spiritual well-being. So when a child feels intensely threatened by an event that they are involved in or witness, we call that event a trauma. There's a range of traumatic events or types of trauma types to which children and adolescents can be exposed. And we sometimes talk about this as big T and little t. So big T trauma are some of the things that you'd expect, like accident or violence, physical violence. And little t trauma are sometimes the things that we don't really think about that affect children or adolescents or our adults, but that do really have a big impact on them and feel like a traumatic event. And that could be the end of a friendship or a relationship or a move or things that actually impact them in ways that we don't quite understand, but they interpret as trauma. So while this isn't a trauma-informed practices in schools training, it is important for us to just have a shared understanding and knowledge. So I'm going to talk a little bit through the basics of trauma and what it means for students. But if you have some specific questions about trauma-informed practices, please put them in the chat and we can hopefully connect you with some additional links and resources. So what is a trauma-informed school? The National Child Traumatic Stress Network defines a trauma-informed school as a system in which all teachers, school administrators, staff, students, families, and community members recognize and respond to the behavioral, emotional, and relational and academic impacts of traumatic stress and those within the school system. So when a school is trauma-informed, learning is increased, students feel safe and supported, and outcomes improve for everyone. And now more than ever, we know that all students need and will benefit from being in a trauma-informed school. One model for talking about trauma-informed schools uses the HEART framework and the 6 guiding principles. So the HEARTS framework is a healthy environments and response to traumas in schools. And this comes from the San Francisco Department of Public Health and has been adapted by Resilient Futures, which is an organization in Colorado that works to train schools and school systems on the HEARTS framework. And the framework, as you can see, includes understanding trauma and stress, cultural humility and equity, safety and predictability, compassion and dependability, resilience and social emotional learning, and empowerment and collaboration. And you'll see as we keep going how this aligns with the core principles that ClassroomWISE addresses on trauma-informed practices in Module 5 as well. So this module addresses ACEs, which is adverse childhood experiences. So it's important for us to have a basic understanding of ACEs and how it fits into the trauma-informed approach. The ACEs pyramid represents the conceptual framework of the ACEs study. And the study uncovered how ACEs are strongly related to the development of risk factors for disease and well-being throughout the life course. The study helped us understand how ACEs affect people's health and helps us to do more research on trauma in young people. And this is information from the CDC, and these images are from a resource from the CDC, and there's a few more coming up, and the whole resource is in the resource collection under Module 5 in ClassroomWISE. We don't need to discuss ACEs with students or ask them about which ones they have experienced because that may likely traumatize them, and we also don't need to know that. It's enough to know generally that they're likely to have been impacted. We know that economic hardship and divorce or separation of a parent or guardian are the most common ACEs reported nationally and in all states. Just under half, about 45% of children in the United States have experienced at least one ACE. 1 in 10 children nationally has experienced 3 or more ACEs, placing them in a category of especially high risk. And children of different races and ethnicities do not experience ACEs equally. Nationally, 61% of Black non-Hispanic children and 51% of Hispanic children have experienced at least one ACE, compared to 40% of white non-Hispanic children and only 23% of Asian non-Hispanic children. On the bright side, the science of ACEs also reveals opportunities to improve the lives of children and adults. And ClassroomWISE covers, Module 5 really covers two or three of these strengths and protective factors. It talks about teaching healthy relationship skills, intervening to lessen immediate and long-term harms, and tangentially, we can make an argument for connecting youth with caring adults. And this is from that same CDC resource. So let's talk a little bit about stress and its connection to trauma. So we all experience stress. Stress is the body's physiological and cognitive response to situations and events that we perceive as threats or challenges. Stress is a normal part of life, and learning to cope with stress is an important part of development. A positive stress response is a normal and essential part of healthy development, characterized by brief increases in heart rate and mild elevations in hormone levels. Some situations that might trigger a positive stress response are like the first day of school or giving a presentation like on ClassroomWISE today. A tolerable stress response activates the body's alert system to a greater degree as a result of more severe, longer lasting difficulties, such as the loss of a loved one, a natural disaster, a universal pandemic, or a frightening injury. If the activation is time limited and buffered by relationships with adults who help the child adapt, the brain and other organs recover from what might otherwise be damaging effects. The stress response in our body's natural reaction to stressful events. The brain becomes aware of potential threat and sends signals to the body to prepare for a potential need to take action, which is our fight, flight, run away, or freeze, shut down response. The body in turn produces a number of stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline, and neurotransmitters that increase the heart rate and respiratory rate. Our stress response is unconscious response to protect us from potential danger. The body's stress response is intended to be short-lived and return back to baseline. Strong, frequent, and prolonged activation of the stress response system in the absence of support is referred to as toxic stress response. Being in a constant state of fight or flight changes how the brain operates in ways that can have significant negative effects on all aspects of development across the lifespan. The brain responds to these circumstances by organizing itself around surviving at the expense of developing skills associated with positive development and resilience. Several adverse life events that may contribute to toxic stress response include neglect and abuse, divorce and separation, death of a loved one, exposure to domestic violence, incarceration of a parent or a family member, neighborhood violence, extreme poverty, parent or family member abusing drugs or alcohol, and parent or caregiver having a mental illness or neglect. And it's even more impacted when these events are coming from the adult that a child thinks to go to for support and protection. So ClassroomWISE goes into greater detail about ACEs and toxic stress and how trauma is one kind of toxic stress. It addresses the fight, flight, and freeze response, as well as behaviors you might see trauma-impacted students exhibit in your classroom. So it's important to have the same background information, understanding on trauma events, how trauma affects the brain development, which is why this is a great module to use even if you're not going to do the whole ClassroomWISE course. So this module or any part of it can really be pulled out to provide professional development or to enhance or align with additional training that you may be doing on trauma in your school. So these images again are from the same CDC resource that's included in the Module 5 resource collection. So the window of tolerance is a term coined by Dr. Dan Siegel that is now commonly used to understand and describe normal brain and body reactions, especially following adversity. It's a term used to describe the range in which a person can function most effectively. When people are within this zone, They are typically able to readily receive, process, and integrate information. Hyperarousal is characterized by excessive activation, often in the form of anxiety, panic, fear, hypervigilance, anger, and agitation. This keeps our system stuck on and impacts our ability to relax, often making it difficult to sleep, eat, digest food, and optimally manage our emotions. Often the students that are most on our radar are in the state of hyperarousal, as they may be externalizing their behavior. Hypoarousal may occur when we have too much arousal, surpassing the limits of pain or emotional overwhelm that our bodies and brains can tolerate, causing us to plunge into a state of hypoarousal, which is like the shutting down or disassociating. In this state, our system can be stuck on off, characterized by exhaustion, depression, flat affect, numbness, disconnection, disassociation. Hypoarousal impacts our sleep in ways that we want to sleep all the time. It may also impact our appetite and digestion and make it hard for us to make us feel emotionally deadened. In school settings, this can be misinterpreted for students that are unmotivated, disengaged, or don't care about learning. Given the stress that we all are collectively under these days, most of us have a thinner window of tolerance. Widening this lens, students, families, and colleagues may not have as much capacity as we've had in the past. So engaging in activities to widen the window of tolerance for all of us is very important and helpful. So learning to read, write, take part in a discussion, and solve mathematical problems rests on many underlying foundations like organization, comprehension, memory, the ability to produce work, engage in learning, and trust. Another prerequisite for achieving classroom competency is the ability to self-regulate attention, emotions, and behaviors. Not surprisingly then, trauma resulting from overwhelming experiences has the power to disrupt a student's development in these foundations for learning. Trauma can also interfere with the capacity for creative play, which is one of the ways that children learn to cope with problems of everyday life. And this is information from trauma-sensitive schools. And then it's also important for us to recognize and be aware of the effects of stigma and racism on students and how that is experienced as a trauma as well. So we're going to watch a video that is from Module 5 that talks about the impacts of learning on trauma.
Trauma has a significant impact on the brain. Trauma literally changes the shape and function of the brain. And so when we experience a really stressful event, there are stress hormones that are released. And so those hormones are having an impact on certain areas of the brain. And so we see that for students who have experienced trauma, that there are more difficulties with concentration, with sometimes language development, sometimes there are IQ delays. And so when we think about that in the context of school, students who have experienced significant trauma may have greater difficulty in school. They may exhibit certain behaviors that may cause difficulty and challenges in the classroom. And so oftentimes, unfortunately, those students are disciplined harshly because of some behaviors, and school staff may not have an awareness that there was a traumatic experience or even know how to appropriately support that student. So it is really important for educators to be aware of trauma and the impact that it can have on behavior and learning.
We know that for our students, when they've experienced something traumatic, it can impact the brain directly. We know, for example, that when someone experiences a traumatic event, it turns up what we call the emotional center of their brain, or the survival part of their brain, which has to do with something called the amygdala. And it essentially sets off alarms. So it puts us into what we think of as a fight, flight, or freeze response. And that's natural. It's our way of protecting ourselves. The difficulty comes that when young people have experienced severe or chronic trauma, the survival part of their brain turns up in situations where it doesn't need to, and it can make them less able to function in a positive way in their environment. The other thing that trauma does in the brain is it turns down what we call the thinking part of the brain, and that's your prefrontal cortex, your hippocampus that is responsible for creating potent memories of events. And we see that when young people have experienced trauma, that part of their brain stops working as well. And you can imagine in the school environment, when the thinking part of your brain is compromised, it makes it very difficult for students to access the learning environment. It makes it more difficult to concentrate, to organize, to plan. And so it's really important that we pay attention to the negative impact on brain architecture of trauma. Again, the positive note here is that teachers can actually help reshape the architecture of the brain for young people who have experienced trauma. We see that positive pathways can be rebuilt even after young people have experienced very difficult traumatic events. And we can essentially turn up the thinking parts of the brain through positive relationships. We see the neurological pathways for young people change in positive ways through fostered relationships with their teachers.
It's really important to be aware that not all students who experience a traumatic event or experience are going to experience a lot of negative outcomes. So there are many students who are extremely resilient, even though they have experienced traumatic events. And so it's important to be aware that there are certain protective factors that can really help students so that if they have experienced a trauma, it does not have the same impact on them. So we know definitely having that connection with a positive, supportive adult and having positive experiences, and even the way that families and friends support a student after a trauma can have a really important impact on decreasing and mitigating the impact of that stressor.
So given all that information, you've likely seen some of these behaviors in your classroom that either you knew were related to trauma response or you're thinking now that they may have been related. So what are some of those behaviors that you've seen in your classroom that may be a response to trauma or misinterpreted as misbehavior? Like what are you seeing? What does it look like? So we'd love for you to put some examples in the chat. I'm going to talk through how this might show up differently for students. And then when I'm done, then I'd love for Stefanie or Sarah. Sarah Parker McMinn is also with us. I didn't introduce her earlier. She's the school mental health lead with the Great Lakes MHTTC. So we'll have them kind of share what's in the chat when we get to it. So love to just kind of hear what you've seen or experienced or maybe even misinterpreted as misbehavior that probably was a trauma response. So witnessing family violence and being scared about people getting hurt may impact how a student reacts to events in school. For example, if one student bumps into them, it's possible the student will misinterpret the unexpected contact as a threat and react by fighting or hitting the other student. Or the same student can hear a loud noise that they misinterpret as someone yelling or threatening sound. The limbic system can activate a flight response, in which case the student may scream and run out of the class. Or the same student may respond by freezing. For example, they can interpret redirection from a teacher as a threat and may put their head down on their desk and refuse to speak to anyone. So while all these responses look different, the event and experiences were the same. As a teacher, it's important to be aware of the source of student behavior so we can respond in a caring and helpful way. So I'd love to hear what we're seeing in the chat. What are some of the things that you've talked about, some traumatic responses that you may have seen?
We haven't had any responses yet.
Oh, okay.
I was also putting resources in for helping become a trauma-informed school. So I might have biffed it a little, I apologize. So if you want to ask the question again.
That's okay. If you wanted to share some of the responses that you've seen, some things that, we've mentioned is, trouble and that have come up, trouble forming relationships with teachers, poor self-regulation, negative thinking, hypervigilance, executive function challenges. So if you had anything that you wanted to share, that's great. Otherwise, we can move on and we'll have more opportunities to hear from you.
We see inability to focus and pay attention, difficulty forming relationships and lack of trust coming from Carmen.
Thank you. So from our poll, some of you have not really done work around trauma in your schools. And so there could be a lot of different reasons for that, but some people feel like they really have to make the case for why trauma-informed practices belong in schools. And so we wanted to talk a little bit through that and provide some information in places where you can get some of those resources if that's something that you're in the position to have to make the case for this. So between 1/2 and 2/3 of all school-age children experience trauma, and more than 30% of children have multiple traumatic experiences. These statistics do not account for the ongoing racial discrimination and microaggressions that students of color experience, nor the lasting mental health impacts of COVID-19 pandemic, suggesting that the actual rate of child trauma may be much, much higher. Children who have experienced trauma tend to be disciplined more often at school and are frequently labeled as problem children. Punitive responses to trauma-based behavior can be particularly damaging to students of color who are more likely to be suspended or expelled than their white counterparts. And without intervention, unaddressed trauma can be the first step of the school to prison pipeline. Schools that recognize and respond to child trauma have seen gains in student achievement and reduced incidences of delinquency. And so the Child Traumatic Stress Network refers to the 4 R's. So specifically, trauma-informed school promotes a safe and welcoming climate, seeks to create structured and predictable learning environments that minimize unnecessary trauma and loss reminders, focuses on building positive and attuned relationships between teachers and students and among school staff, focuses on building, has anti-bullying and suicide prevention programs and uses a balanced restorative justice approach to conflict and conflict mediation within appropriate disciplinary actions. So now we'd love to hear from you again. Really get a sense of how you see ClassroomWISE fitting into existing trauma-informed practices or programs at your school, or if you're not already doing some of those programs, how you see it fitting into mental health supports at your school. So you may be in a position where you may have experience of rolling out some mental health programs in your schools. So we want to know how it might fit into existing priorities or align with what you're already doing. And again, if you're in a position that making the case for this, then you may have to message to your school or district or decision makers about how ClassroomWISE might be value added. So this is a way to kind of create some of those talking points. So we're going to open the Padlet, and we'd love to have you just share some thoughts of how you see this fitting in, or what additional information you might need to help this fit in or support, or how ClassroomWISE would work within your school and trauma-informed programs and mental health programs. I think we dropped the Padlet link in the chat. See, there's some typing in action, and we'll definitely come back to this at the end as well and share and see what else is up there. So as we go, keep thinking about how you might integrate this and how it would most be useful to you in your school. And if you're more comfortable using the chat, that's great too. So there's comment came in. We do regular staff training around trauma-informed practices and social emotional learning. This would be a great resource to add to our staff training. Great, glad to think that. And again, as I've said, you can take pieces and parts of it in whatever way might align and help support what you're already doing. All right, we're going to come back to the Padlet, but please keep adding some thoughts there. Oh, there's one more coming in. Need an elevator speech with bullets, integrating SEL, MTSS, equity, mental health, trauma response, and with evidence and continuous improvement in data that's accessible to inform practice to districts? Yes. Having all of that and how it all integrates is a very helpful resource. And so we can look into how we could provide something like that, because there is so many different pieces and it kind of gets hard talking about all of it together without getting without kind of losing people off and getting people overwhelmed with all the different ways to go. So thanks so much for that. So the key principles of trauma-informed practices in schools, according to ClassroomWISE, are these principles: safety, of trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and cultural, historic, and gender issues. And all of these principles are addressed within the Module 5. For cultural, historic, and gender issues, I like to call this cultural humility, but it's really about creating safe space for the discussion of identity, acknowledging and countering structural racism and discrimination. So there's a lot of other frameworks as you go that you might see when you work with trauma-informed practices. A lot of people use different words with a lot of similar meanings. So we'll touch on some of those other words in a minute as well. So several of the strategies that we know to be trauma-informed and help students impacted by trauma and not re-traumatize them are built into the first 3 modules of ClassroomWISE. So I'm gonna show you a couple of these as an example so you can see what it looks like and how you start thinking about what you're already doing and what you'd like to be doing and integrating these principles in your school. So these next couple slides highlight some of the specific principles that are highlighted in Module 5, as well as specific skills embedded throughout the course. So this is one example of trauma-informed principles presented. And so there's videos, at least one, sometimes more, for each of these principles, and as well as resources. And this is on trust and transparency, which are essential. Teachers can foster trust with students by demonstrating mutual respect and by communicating clear, consistent, predictable rules and routines in the classroom. So I'm going to show you one more video so you can get an idea of how you could use some of these videos.
So how I create trust and transparency in the classroom is just present my real authentic self. Because I feel like children know when you are being genuine, when you are being authentic, and when you are just there to teach and get a paycheck,
How you create trust and transparency begins with first engaging with the student on their own terms. By that, I mean allowing a student to approach you in a comfortable way, take down the walls a bit between the teacher and the student. Being able to have a conversation with the student, not as a little kid, right? You as the adult, them as the little kid, or where there's that hierarchy between teacher and student, but just as person to person. In doing so, you allow the student to feel that you have no agenda with talking to them other than hearing them out. And honestly, we all need to be heard, and that's probably the first step to creating that trust and transparency that you seek in the classroom.
Once students trust you, they will feel more comfortable in the classroom. You'll notice that they will comply more. They will complete assignments more. So I'm open. They can always come talk to me. Just know that I have an open door policy, and establishing that trust and that transparency is what gets the children to kind of like connect with me.
So as I mentioned, the rest of the principles within Module 5 within the curriculum are safety, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment of voice and choice. And so, as I said, this is ClassroomWISE talks about cultural, historical, and gender issues. And I prefer the term cultural humility, which is really a lifelong process of self-reflection and self-critique, whereby one not only learns about another's culture, but one starts with an examination of their own beliefs and cultural identities. And that's the definition that the National Institutes of Health gives for cultural humility. And this module really stresses the importance of creating safe space, and as well as providing tips of how to do that, to have the conversations about identity, about discrimination, about racism. in your classrooms. And so while cultural responsiveness and humility is kind of integrated into all of the modules, by using inclusive language and having conversations about differences in schools, and it's called out specifically in Module 5, but it's really woven throughout the whole course. There is a new module that will be coming in winter of 2022, which is sooner than we know, that the Central East MHTTC, which is Region 3, has been working on with the National Center for School Mental Health. And it's called Cultural Inclusiveness and Equity-Wise, or CIE-Wise. And it comes with the same videos and resource collections, and will also be housed on our ClassroomWISE website. So we'll share a link to the chat on the one-pager about it, but we're really excited that while we feel like the course generally helps with cultural inclusiveness, there's going to be an even more emphasis on it and even more great resources to share with you soon. So ClassroomWISE addresses many of the trauma-informed best practices and strategies in modules 1 through 3 about creating safe and supportive classrooms, reducing stigma, social and emotional skills, learning and relationships, clear expectations and communication. We know that connection is everything, and relationships are so important. The power and importance of relationships is heavily stressed within the whole curriculum, and especially in the first 3 modules, because it's hard to support students in need without that relational foundation. So those first 3 modules really help build up that foundation, and then you're in a place where you can support students when they're at a place of need. And so one way that we make connections is with self-regulation and co-regulation, both for ourselves and to model for our students. So when students see the adults in their lives modeling these skills, it increases their ability to use the skills as well. And in order to be there for our students and be with our students and be in relationship, we need to also take care of ourselves. One way of doing that, a small way, is having like a portable practice. I love this term of something that you can do and use anywhere. When you're walking down the hall into class, when you step outside to catch a breath of air, if you ever have that luxury. And they're very simple things that you can do by putting your hand on your chest and feeling your heartbeat, or rubbing your fingers together to get your brain from stop going in circles and taking it to a more physical place, or breathing exercise that works for you, mantras, gratitude practices, whatever these things are, but knowing them in advance so that you can pull them out and do them whenever or wherever, or for whatever reason that you might need that. So I'd love to hear again in the chat, what are some of these kind of portable practices or little things that you do during the day that help you regulate yourselves and help you, stay in that window of tolerance. So please drop some ideas, some things that you personally do that work for you in the chat. Maybe we can all learn a new one today. So, like I said, the rest of these are woven through ClassroomWISE, and especially modules 1 through 3. Last, there is a module on social emotional learning, which we discussed in detail in the same way last week of how it integrates what you might already be doing in social emotional learning with ClassroomWISE. And we talked about the connection between social emotional learning and mental health, why social emotional learning is part of a mental health literacy course. So mental health and social emotional learning are different in their meaning, consequences, but it doesn't mean they're unrelated. Social and emotional competencies help children engage in difficulties life brings and maintain good mental health. Therefore, teaching all students social emotional competencies serves at the aim of supporting children's mental health. And lastly, I really wanted to highlight resilience, which is a theme woven throughout the course. Again, Resilient Futures talks about, gives us this great definition of resilience and talks about these 3 skills of connection, coping, and competence that helps to build resilience in our students and in ourselves. We know that the presence of caring and supportive relationships mitigate the effects of stress and promote lifelong healthy development, that positive environments and relationships catalyze learning, and that all these themes, again, are woven throughout the course. So as I said, this is a 3-part training package. And so we've just really dug into part 1, which is the course. And part 2 is a video library. It's the series of high impact brief videos that incorporate both student voice and educative strategies to give teachers ideas and examples on how all students feel welcome in the classroom. And so you've seen a few, and I just realized now I didn't show you any with students. But all the videos threaded throughout the course are available as standalone. So they're all 1 to 2 minutes, and you can go to the video library, even if you're not using the course, to share some of these videos or enhance other training or professional development that you may be doing. And there's a video for each of the principles of the trauma-informed practices in Module 5. There's 9 videos total in Module 5. And then part 3 of this 3-part training package is similarly a resource collection, which houses a comprehensive resource collection, including tip sheets, toolkits, and educator-friendly examples that were developed specifically for this project, as well as many other national experts in school mental health that accompany the online course that were previously created. So as you go through the course, you'll see that there's a symbol that lets you know when there's additional resource for that content. You come to this resource collection and you can find it there. And again, you can use any of these resources at any time, regardless of whether or not you're using or doing the course. So here's an example of some of the resources you'll find for Module 5 that you can use with ClassroomWISE or on their own. So for Module 5, there's 2 groupings of resources. One is on childhood trauma and the ACEs, and the other is on demonstrating trauma-sensitive teaching practices. And so there's one of each bucket is displayed here. The types of trauma resource on your left is a resource that provides a review of various types of trauma that impact people on a daily basis. And this was created specifically for ClassroomWISE. And then the other on the right is the principles of a trauma-informed approach, which provides a summary of SAMHSA's guide for a trauma-informed approach that can be applied in the classroom. And there are probably 20 more resources. Oops, I did not mean to do that. Sorry. What just happened?
We see the Padlet right now.
Okay, perfect. I lost my share.
Now we see your background.
Yep. Okay. Sorry about that. Let's get back to where we were. Okay. Okay, so we are pretty much almost at the end of this webinar. Thank you all for your patience. I just have a few more things I want to add, and then we really want to hear from you again and any questions or thoughts that you have. So as I've said, ClassroomWISE is a new resource package, and we know that there's a lot of other options or things that you might be considering to use or using already. And so you really need to look at whether or not ClassroomWISE is duplicative of what you're already doing or if it offers something new. So it's designed to eliminate a number of barriers of other mental health trainings for teachers that schools face, and to address needs in the field that were not already being met, and to add value. So one of the first ways we think that it does that is that it is completely free. So mental health literacy trainings can be pretty costly, and we believe that mental health knowledge should be accessible to everyone regardless of cost. We know that everybody learns differently, and so self-paced means that it's more accessible to learning and retention for a diverse audience, so you can really do it as quick or as slow as you want, or pick it up whenever you have the time to do it. It's efficiently packed with essential information, and it averages about 6 hours of training. It's available 24/7, 365 days a year, so you can fit it into your day or your life whenever it fits. Unlike standalone trainings, you can access it anytime. So we wanted this to be as accessible as possible for everyone's schedule, as we know that you all have very busy, full plates. And lastly, it's interactive. So while live trainings are great, and many of us prefer them, I know I prefer them, our priority was to make this as accessible to as many people as possible. So we worked to design this for the balance of accessibility and interactivity. And so lastly, if you are someone in a position to be making the case for adding ClassroomWISE or using it in any way, it's really important to have data to back up the need for it. And so having data on the school-wide level, on your district level or community, state, national, whatever level you think would be most compelling to the decision makers at your school. So one way to get some data is the SHAPE system. Hopefully you're all familiar with that. We'll drop the link in the chat as well. And it's also through the National Center for School Mental Health, and it is also free. And it has a variety of different surveys and evaluation tools and indicators to start tracking how your school is doing in school mental health. And you can focus on different areas. You can use these surveys as baseline or at intervals throughout the year to see how your school is moving in one direction or in one area or not moving. And then really have that data to share with your school about making the case of why to integrate some of these practices, why you might need to use some mental health literacy training for teachers. So with that said, again, I want to thank you so much for being with us today. And I want to thank you all for all that you do every day for the school mental health of our young people. And we know especially what a year and how hard this year has been, and we appreciate all that you do every day. We hope that you'll reach out to us with any questions, ideas, and suggestions for using ClassroomWISE. Since this is new, we're learning as we go. We're learning what is most useful for people and how it could be best utilized. So we'd love to hear from you what else would help support your use of this, and how it kind of looks in where you are. As we know, it looks different in different parts of the country. So I am going to pull up the Padlet again, and I'd love to hear any questions or thoughts or comments that you have as we've gone.
Stefanie, we had one question. They asked, do you have a link to the disproportionality of the discipline, i.e. trauma, SPED, BIPOC being disciplined, suspended exclusionary methods?
We can definitely find some resources for that. I know that some of the organizations that I mentioned, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network has a lot of data on that. TraumaInformed Schools website also has a lot of data on that. I think SAMHSA will also have a lot of data, so you can find that kind of information that will help making your case. But if you don't find that, please reach out to Sarah, and we'll help find those, help link you with that data. So one more comment that came up on the Padlet was about, oh, I think it's the same comment. Behavior, restorative discipline, chronic absenteeism, and adult SEL, safe and supportive schools, well-being, basically operationalized holistically and packaged. The schools see this so as too much or as one and the same. Thus, we do this versus this. How do we show up and engage and lean in on a daily basis and reflect with the data and collaborative partners? Yeah, so there's a lot of different pieces, and we know that it becomes overwhelming to kind of make the case for all the different pieces. And that's one of the reasons that ClassroomWISE was created, to kind of pull all of this in together in a way to make it a little bit more comprehensive and a little easier to make a little more palatable, I suppose. Are there any other questions or comments?
I was just putting some links to some SAMHSA sites that I'm not 100% sure covers the question that I had read out previously. And Sarah just put one for the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. That doesn't cover what you were asking. Just let us know. I just wanted to make sure we hold it open for a moment so folks can grab links out of the chat if they would like to.
Great. Yeah, please reach back out to Sarah if you're not finding the resources that you are looking for, and we can do a little bit more digging to find that for you. And so I just thank you again. Thanks so much for being with us today, and thanks for your questions and participation. And hopefully you will join us on our final webinar, and we wish you all a great holiday week, however you celebrate next week.
And thank you so much, Stefanie, for a great presentation.
Thank you.